There was a time when the US and Iran were close allies. The US supported Iran's king, and in return, Iran offered them trust and oil. Their relationship took a drastic turn after the 1970s, and the US became Iran's biggest enemy.
هدفهای آمریکا در مسائل منطقی درست نقطه مقابل هدفهای ماست.
Since then, the two countries have been in conflict with each other.
Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. We don't want to be tough on Iran.
باید غنیسازی داشته باشه یا نداشته باشه. به شما چه؟
This is the story of how US and Iran's friendship turned sour over the years. Before getting into the friendship between Iran and the US, let me tell you a story. So Iran is a major global oil power, and many world superpowers have relied on its energy resources. But before the 1900s, nobody knew that Iran had large amounts of oil. So in 1901, a British man named William Darcy came across a report that Iran might have a lot of oil. He quickly made a deal with Iran's king at the time. The deal said that Iran would get 16% of the profit made from oil sales and an annual amount that was also fixed that will be given to Iran. Now, after several years of searching for oil in Iran, when William ran out of funds, he was forced to reach out to the British government for more funds to carry out his expedition. And finally, in 1908, a huge oil field was discovered in southwest Iran. It was the first major oil find in the Middle East. A year later, William, who had the support of the British government, formed a company with the government of Iran called Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became the British Petroleum Company. So Iran drew global attention after the discovery of huge oil fields. Now coming back to the US-Iran relationship. So during World War II, Britain and the Soviet Union invaded Iran to secure oil fields, taking control of its roads, railways and food supply. This caused mass starvation, inflation soared, and the famine that followed killed 3 to 4 million people between 1942 to 1943, although the exact number remains unknown. Then the US stepped in and along with Britain provided food aid to help Iran beat famine. Even after the Second World War ended, Soviet troops refused to leave Iran. So in 1946, Iran complained to the UN Security Council about the situation, and it was backed by the US at the time by speaking out against the Soviet Union during Security Council debates. The US officials didn't want Iran, with its oil and strategic location, to fall into Soviet hands. Quick fact: Iran is located between the Soviet Union and the Indian Ocean, near major oil routes through which large amounts of oil are transported to the rest of the world. So Iran's oil wealth and position near US allies such as Saudi Arabia made it strategically important to America during World War II. Coming back to when Iran complained to the UN about Soviet troops, the Soviets then faced international pressure from both the US and the UN, along with the threat of economic sanctions. As a result, the Soviet troops eventually withdrew from Iran, ending the crisis. Things took a dramatic turn in 1951 when Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh decided to take control of Iran's oil. Until then, British and US companies had taken most of the oil profits. Mossadegh and his government viewed this as unfair, arguing that the deal violated Iran's rights under international law. Basically, he wanted that money to go to the Iranian people. So his government nationalized the Iranian oil industry, which meant that US and UK companies could no longer extract oil from Iran. Now, this was a huge setback for the UK and the US. So, in response to the nationalization of the oil industry, the British Petroleum Company called for a worldwide boycott of Iranian oil. The US also joined in 1952, which caused Iran to plunge into financial crisis. The US and UK thought that Prime Minister Mossadegh would compromise with the nationalization issue, but he didn't give up. So in 1953, the US along with the UK launched a secret mission called Operation Ajax to remove Mossadegh from power. The Central Intelligence Agency of the US worked with groups that were against Prime Minister Mossadegh. They used bribes, threats, and pressure to gain influence. On 19 August 1953, the Iranian military, supported by street protests, organized and funded by the CIA, overthrew Mossadegh and removed him from power. Quick fact: the CIA publicly admitted for the first time later in 2013 about its involvement in the secret mission against Prime Minister Mossadegh as part of the wider efforts to declassify historical documents. Coming back to 1953, the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi gained full power and signed over 40% of Iran's oil fields to US companies. The Shah was seen as a trusted ally by the United States, but many Iranians felt that he was a puppet of the US.
Who says that my people are demanding the democracy that you have?
In 1955, Iran and the US signed the Treaty of Amity to strengthen economic ties and promise fair treatment for each other's citizens and businesses. It was basically a friendship agreement. During the 1960s and 1970s, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was a high-ranking cleric, and his supporter Ayatollah Ali Khamenei began opposing the Shah's rule and his Western-focused modernization policies.
گونگی زندگی اجتماعی اسلامی معناش چیست؟ این در قرآن و در نهج البلاغه و در روایات می شود پیدا کرد. او اشداء علی الکفار وجود دارد، یعنی مرزبندی با دشمن.
The opposition was not limited to religious clerics. College students, workers and merchants also joined together against the Shah. The mass uprising eventually forced the Shah to flee from Iran to Egypt in January 1979. This led to the Islamic Revolution and the Shah was overthrown. Iran became an Islamic republic ruled by Islamic law and deeply against Western influence, especially from the US. The protesting students were afraid that the US would help the Shah to come in power again, as it had done in 1953. So in November 1979, some of these students stormed the US embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage, holding them for over 400 days. Although the hostages were released in January 1981 after the US promised non-interference in Iran's affairs, tensions between the two countries remained high.
No act has so galvanized the American public toward unity in the last decade as has the holding of our people as hostages in Tehran.
When Iran went to war with Iraq in 1980, the US initially said it was neutral, but soon started supporting Iraq with intelligence, economic aid, and military equipment. The situation between the US and Iran became more tense in 1988 when a US Navy ship accidentally shot down an Iranian passenger plane, killing over 290 people on board. By the end of the decade, both countries were openly in conflict. In the 1900s and 2000s, the US began calling Iran a state sponsor of terrorism.
Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom.
The US started voicing its concerns about Iran's support for armed groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas in places such as Lebanon and Palestine. The US considered these groups as terrorist organizations.
They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States.
But the biggest issue that dominated those years was the nuclear program. Iran developed nuclear technology, saying it's for energy production. But the US and other countries feared it could be used to build a weapon. Because of these concerns, the US started putting economic sanctions on Iran. These made it harder for Iran to trade with other countries or even travel internationally. The sanctions caused serious problems for Iran's economy.
من تأکید می‌کنم که جمهوری اسلامی هرگز در پی تسلیم نیست و نیز هرگز از حق ملت خود در استفاده صلح‌آمیز از انرژی هسته‌ای چشم پوشید.
In 2002, then US President George Bush said,
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world by seeking weapons of mass destruction.
This was seen as an insult in Iran and it deepened the hostility between the two countries.
ما از هیچ کس نمیترسیم. ما قدرت و توانایی لازم را برای دفاع از حقوق خودمون همیشه داریم و از این حقوق کوتاه نمیاییم. کسی حق نداره که حق ملت رو در اینجا مورد معامله قرار بده.
In In 2015, when Iran's economy was struggling under heavy international sanctions, Supreme Leader Khamenei authorized a deal in which Iran agreed to reduce its nuclear stockpile and stop work on advanced machines used for enrichment. Quick fact. When a country enriches uranium, other countries watch closely because the same process used to make the nuclear energy can also be used to make bombs if taken far enough. Now, in return for Iran reducing its nuclear stockpile, 6 major powers, including the US, lifted key sanctions to provide economic relief to Iran.
It is a great honor for us to announce that we have reached an agreement on the Iranian nuclear issue. With courage, political will, mutual respect and leadership, we delivered on what the world was hoping for, a shared commitment to peace and to join hands in order to make our world safer.
This agreement was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. Khamenei publicly endorsed the agreement, calling it a milestone. But he also warned Iranians.
مذاکره با آمریکا صرفاً در قضیه هسته‌ای است ولا غیر. اینو همه بدونن. ما درباره مسائل منطقی با آمریکا مذاکره‌ای نمی‌کنیم. هدف‌های آمریکا در مسائل منطقی درست نقطه مقابل هدف‌های ماست.
Although in 2018, US President Trump pulled the US out of the Iranian nuclear deal, saying it wasn't strong enough, he reimposed sanctions on Iran. Now remember the 1955 treaty between Iran and the US that encouraged economic cooperation between the two nations? So Iran used that treaty to take the US to the International Court of Justice, arguing that new US sanctions under President Trump broke the treaty. In response, Trump's administration said it was withdrawing from the treaty. The treaty was one of the last formal ties between the US and Iran.
آمریکاست، انگلیس خبیث است و رژیم منحوس و سرطانی صهیونیستی است. اینا دشمنای اصلی هستند.
Things again took an ugly turn in 2020 when the US launched a drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, a top Iranian general.
Soleimani was plotting imminent and sinister attacks on American diplomats and military personnel, but we caught him in the act and terminated him.
The Iranian government retaliated by firing missiles at US military bases in Iraq. Many people feared that war was about to break out.
We did not take action to start a war.
Ultimately, both sides chose to de-escalate and pulled back. But the incident left a lasting impact on the US-Iran relationship. Now in 2025, amid the Iran-Israel conflict, Israel said that they had clear intelligence that Iran was speeding up its nuclear program. The officials added that Iran was enriching uranium to about 60% purity, which is very close to the 90% level needed to make a nuclear bomb. Israel saw this as a serious threat and believed Iran was getting too close to being able to build a nuclear weapon, and the strikes were needed to stop that before it was too late.
مطلبی که ما در باب هسته‌ای به طرف‌های آمریکایی و غیره میگیم اینه که شما چه کاره‌ای؟ چرا دخالت می‌کنید؟
Since the US was considered Israel's strongest ally, President Trump called on Iran to enter into negotiations over its nuclear program. He described the moment as the possible second chance for Iranian leaders to avoid more damage.
For me, it's very simple. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. We don't want to be tough on Iran. We don't want to be tough on anybody, but they just can't have a nuclear weapon.
Then in June 2025, there were reports that said that US President Trump rejected an Israeli plan to assassinate Iran's supreme leader, to which Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said,
"It's not going to escalate the conflict, it's going to end the conflict."
Or are you going to target the supreme leader?
Look, we're doing what we need to do. I'm not going to get into the details.
Then on 17th June, while the conflict was escalating between Israel and Iran, Trump said Iran's supreme leader is hiding but doesn't want to kill him for now. Trump urged Iran's unconditional surrender, to which Khamenei refused.
صدمه آمریکا اگر ورود در این میدان بشه، ورود نظامی در این میدان بکنه، صدمه جبران ناپذیری خواهد بود بدون تردید.
Then Iran and Israel continued exchanging fire.
اسم تسلیم برای یک چنین کشوری مایه استهزاء کسانی است که ملت ایران رو میشنن.
But on 21st June 2025, the United States launched strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear sites, escalating the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran.
Islamic Republic of Iran condemns in the strongest terms the United States' brutal military aggression against Iran's peaceful nuclear facilities.
In retaliation, Iran said they launched a missile attack on a US military base in Qatar.
از پایگاه‌های مهم آمریکا در منطقه پایگاه العدید حمله کرد.
The US later called for a ceasefire between Iran and Israel on 24th June 2025.
Iran somewhat, by not much, violated the ceasefire. They have fought a hell of a war. They fought very hard. I think the war ended actually when we hit the various nuclear sites with the planes.
This was the story of US and Iran that started with a secret mission. It turned into a revolution. It moved through hostage crisis, wars by proxy, nuclear negotiations, assassinations, and sanctions.
Of course, the way for diplomacy should be always remain open. But, as I said, we are not in the situation right now.
Neither side has walked away. Neither side has fully moved toward resolution. And for now, the relationship remains where it has been for decades, somewhere between conflicts and diplomacy, with no clear ending in sight yet.